Right, so contained within this box right here is an Nvidia graphics card you can buy for about £30 to £40 that has got 8 gigs of VRAM, still up-to-date drivers, and is really easy to get a hold of. So just what exactly is this graphics card? And this is it. This is the Quadro M4000, and it might look like a bit of a boring card. It's got one 6-pin on it. It does actually have plenty of display ports down the side, but this graphics card right here actually has 8 gigs of VRAM and is closely related to a full-fat GTX 970. So let's plug this in, install some drivers, and find out if this is the saviour to the budget graphics card Crysis. Now, when I read the specifications of this card, I was a little bit like, this seems ridiculously cheap if we can make it actually do some gaming, because bordering on 1060 levels of power from the specifications alone, and the fact it only needs one PCIe slot, one 6-pin, and with most Quadro cards having a relatively easy life, you know, they've generally been in systems that are actually cooled and bits and pieces like that, reliability-wise, I'd imagine, yeah, it's just gonna work. But there's a couple of things I want to do today. One, I want to get a hold of this with the drivers it's meant to run, see how it performs with just a nice, lazy, simple setup. Two, see how far you can push it on these drivers. And three, see if we can force it to actually run game-ready ones. And if that means flashing a BIOS, so be it. From what I remember of these, the best way to get performance out of them is to BIOS flash a higher power limit, and then get the card to pretend it's a GTX 970. Apparently that used to work back in the day. We'll see how it does today. It actually does have an SLI bridge, which is interesting. June 25th, 2026. So yes, still driver support. Right, so straight up, version 582.70. We do get a few other little bits and pieces like the RTX Desktop Manager. We'll let these install, just see how it works out of the box, and I mean, I am just curious what an out-of-the-box experience on this looks like. We'll get a baseline 3D Mark score, try it in some games, and then I think we'll have to try overclocking, and if it's still not good enough, we will try BIOS modding. But I've heard mixed reports. Some people say it's great, other people say don't bother, just overclock it. So we'll wait and see. It feels like it's running decently cool. It doesn't feel like it's running hot. So we'll let these drivers install, go from there, and actually find out what the specs are. Yes, GPU clocks are low, but you do get 1664 unified shaders, 8 gigs of GDDR5 memory through a 256-bit memory bus, and everything else checks out. In fact, it checks out so much that these are nearly the exact same specifications as a full-fat GTX 970, just with double the memory. In fact, it's even the same GPU core, it's a GM204. So why don't we open up 3D Mark? I just want to see how it runs out of the box. Temperatures, thermals, bits and pieces like that. Performance is fine for what the card is. An M4000 should actually be in and around this mark. It doesn't really get hot. It gets up to 80 degrees, but then again the fans also haven't ramped up. And it's staying at its very low clock frequency of 700 MHz without a problem. So a lot of the time, gaming performance is not necessarily in correlation with TimeSky scores and 3D Mark scores, because this is now running at a locked 60 frames per second. This is GTA 5 Legacy, and it has defaulted to... Okay, yep, so GTA 5 with ultra settings is running at a locked 60 frames per second. I wonder if there's a cap going on? Oh yeah, it is running at about 60 to 70 frames per second. Yeah, okay, so gaming performance out of the box for a 30 quid graphics card, we're talking GTA 5 at ultra settings at a locked 60 FPS. It gets a bit weird when you uncap the frame rate. I wonder if fast movement causes us any problems, so I'm going to test that real quick. I mean, with a 60 FPS cap in place, it hasn't even dropped a single frame at ultra settings, which is sort of similar to a GTX 970, but we're getting close to that 4GB of VRAM, and of course we have enough VRAM to deal with everything it wants to do, so we aren't dealing with any of the slowdown that you'd get associated with a 970 when it starts going over 3.5GB. We can't change the power limit, which of course is issue number one, because we probably are a little bit power limited. Right, let's bring up GPU-Z as well. Let's see. Now, I think these are capped at 110 watts of power usage, but at the moment we still have about 30% headroom, so I don't think power limits are our problem. Oh no, are we not able to increase the clocks? No. Okay, right. temperatures are getting up in the hotspot to about 85 degrees. Right, let's turn this off. I'm going to look to see what BIOS mods exist, to see if there's anything we can do there. And while we do that, I'm going to take it apart and give it some new thermal paste, see what the state of things are. Yeah, it is a little bit hot to touch. So we'll get this open, see what the state of the thermal paste is, but so far for a 30 quid graphics card, as long as you don't mind a 60 FPS cap, it'll run GTA 5 maxed out, with plenty of headroom left over. I don't think it looks very difficult to take apart. It's so hot. Right, yeah, time to get this thing apart. So getting them apart is a little bit fiddly because of course the connectors for everything are all soldered in place, but still, just giving that a quick clean off, that should be more than good enough. So with a nice and simple repaste, that's brought our temperatures down to a much more manageable sort of 70 to 80 degrees. It really has been a little while since I've done anything like this, but what we want to do is we want to use GPU-Z here to export our BIOS. So if we save this to file on the desktop, lovely, and then we should be able to open GM204 stock in the Maxwell 2 BIOS tweaker. And from here we can go ahead and change things around. I think we should be able to do about 1100. I'll set boost clocks at 1150. So then we just need to flash this. Right, so what we've done here is we've ran NV flash, we've turned off write protection, and now we are about to flash the modified BIOS I've made. So when we push enter, right. What's gone wrong? What I've done is I've gone back to an older version of NV flash. We have now got confirmation that it has flashed my overclocked BIOS I've made. I'm not pushing any crazy high standards here. We are now on to third attempt of flashing the BIOS. This time I've changed where it's going to draw power from with the PCIe and of course the 6-pin adapter, and we will now find out if this is the BIOS that will allow it to game properly. Well, it took a little bit of tweaking around, but we finally do have the GPU clocks up near 1100 megahertz. So yeah, they will go up to 1100 when they're needed to. I've also increased the power limit, I've increased the fan speed so it can go higher when it needs to, and we've also, we've tried to get this as close to being a real GTX 970 as possible. So I'm going to let it run through TimeSpy, see just how much we've actually gained from doing this. You can do it all yourself with the NV tweaker. It's quite easy to do. It's quite fun as well if you enjoy tweaking around with these types of things. This should net us a little bit of extra performance. But you can't just overclock through Afterburner. You've got to do it all the way through BIOS tweaks. Now I will admit it has been quite a lot of fun doing this, but by simply tweaking around the BIOS a little bit, this card has gone from average to legendary, now scoring a score just beneath 3000, which isn't spectacular, but you've got to keep in mind, we've got oodles of VRAM, and that's not a bad score. Temperatures are okay, in and around 85 degrees, and GPU clock frequency, it's doing okay. It is hovering in and around 1050 to 1100 megahertz. I'm going to see if I can turn this up just a smidge more. Now, I might be being a little bit stupid here. You got to remember, stock clocks on this were 700 megahertz. I have just boosted this up to 1350 megahertz. It's doing it. There's no artifacting, to be fair. Yeah, I mean, I will put together a little collection of BIOS files I've made. I've pretty much done everything from 900 megahertz with better fan curves up to 1350. I want to say 1350 is probably going to run toasty, but it seems dead stable. And when it's just free performance to flash a custom BIOS, you might as well. I want to say this is probably going to run at about 90 degrees. 91 degrees is where it will start to throttle. So hopefully that cooler with the fan curves I've set will keep it in and around the high 80s. Yeah, 3292. I'm definitely going to have to modify the fan curve a little bit. You know, I don't even care if it runs toasty. I might just run it like this. Why not? It's free performance is free performance. I'll just put a fan blowing at it. I wonder what this means for gaming. Let's load up a game of some sort, something modern. Now, it's very odd that I leap into testing Oblivion Remastered, but it's a good example of where a lot of these Maxwell era cards, like the GTX 970, like the GTX 980, like a lot of the cards that have in and around 4 gigabytes of VRAM and under, just fall apart. But this, running the stupid overclock we've got on it, and just having 8 gigabytes of VRAM, may actually stand a chance in the modern world when it comes to dealing with bloat, because it has enough memory to hopefully be able to power its way through. I've not tested this yet, I don't know how it's going to run. For all I know, this could be a massive mistake. But if this runs on a 30 quid graphics card, this could very well be the card to go and get. On paper so far, it's amazing. And even if you don't tweak it, out of the box, it'll play things like GTA 5 perfectly fine. Right, so we've got Oblivion Remastered here, loading in 1080p. It's actually loading in. I mean, it's taking some time to load in, but still. So, on an actual GTX 970, this is a sub 30 FPS experience in about 480p, slightly over 480p. But here, on our £30 Quadro, I mean, yes, we should probably do some tweaking around, probably use FSR or something, but it's actually getting 30-ish FPS in 1080p. Now, I could definitely do with going through the settings and actually configuring it properly, but this is Oblivion Remastered. Yeah, it isn't looking pretty with its lowest settings, but it is in a full HD resolution. You just can't do this on a GTX 970. You pretty much can't do it on any card with under 4 gigs of VRAM. But here, on a little Quadro, we're getting 30 frames per second in Oblivion Remastered. Unreal Engine 5 titles running on a 30 quid Quadro. And if it can run this, it'll probably be able to run just about everything, because this is the benchmark that brings most of the older graphics cards down to their knees. But this little Quadro, it handles it fine, which means that I need to find out just how well this is going to hold up in some real gaming. So as we've just seen, this Quadro M4000 is actually a card to be reckoned with, given that it's handling the modern world of Unreal Engine 5 bloat surprisingly well. But what are the specifications that make it so powerful? Well, spec for spec, it pretty much lines up exactly with a GTX 970, but crucially it has some changes that make it a little bit better in the modern world. It's based on the GM204 architecture, which is the exact same Maxwell 2.0 on 28nm, but this time comes with 8GB of GDDR5 memory running through a 256-bit memory bus. And fortunately, the ROPs haven't been cut down, and neither has anything else, meaning that you don't have to worry about the 3.5GB of VRAM debacle that troubles the GTX 970. This is a full, allocatable 8GB on the card. Drivers are up to date as of June 2026 on the Nvidia Quadro driver branch, and you do have 1664 pixel shaders, 64 ROPs as just said, 104 TMUs, and it was released a year after the GTX 970 in 2015. Power consumption out of the box is anywhere between 115 to 130 watts as its true TDP. It'll never hit this on a stock BIOS, however you can quite safely increase this up to around 150 to maybe even 170 watts if you had better cooling to really push this card. But the most compelling thing about it is the price, because these are flying completely under the radar right now, and I don't think the price on these will stick around long, because they are currently selling on eBay at the moment as low as £25 on auctions or £40 for buy it now, which when you consider how everything else has gone up in price, that makes these exceptionally good value. I can't stress how good these cards are for the money. If you're interested already, get looking, because I think they will probably sell out soon. Now with these cards, you don't strictly have to go into the world of BIOS modding to enjoy them. At their stock settings, they will perform admirably. As we just saw in GTA 5 near the start of the video, you can load out with Neon Ultra settings and it will get 60 FPS. But if you want to get the best value for money possible out of these cards, you can't overclock them through MSI Afterburner, at least not on the latest drivers anymore, so you will have to get into the world of BIOS modding, which is really easy to do on these cards. I mean, I'll probably whack a couple of the BIOSes I've made into the Discord for people to download if they want them. Of course, flash these at your own risk, but as it stands at the moment, it's really easy to do yourself. There's the Maxwell tweaker, which you just go around, set your boost levels, set your clock, set your power tables, and then you can just flash this straight to the card with an older version of NV Flash. Done. That's your overclock and your power limits all set up, ready for gaming. However, what kind of difference does this actually make? Well, with a minor overclock, which is kind of how I'd recommend you run a card if you're running the stock cooler, you can run this at 1063 MHz with 1100 MHz boost clock state, and you will return an extra 500 points over the stock settings without the card struggling too much. For the case of myself today, I am running this with the maximum overclock I would feel safe running on the stock board, which is 1240 MHz and 1350 MHz as its boost clocks, nearly double what it comes with out of the box. And with this, we pretty much gained 1000 points over its stock configuration, completely for free. But what does this mean if we actually throw it up into a progression of benchmarks? Cloudgate DirectX 10 is out there with 74,000, so I pretty much had to get rid of it from the graph to be able to show the linear curve. But in Firestrike, it deals with it admirably. This is the Maxwell architecture, it deals with DirectX 11 very well. Time Spike comes in with a pretty good score. More surprisingly though, Steel Nomad Lite actually sees an increase slightly because we have 8 gigs of VRAM, and this is a bit more reminiscent of modern world gaming, and Full Fat Steel Nomad actually ran okay because we have 8 gigs of VRAM on hand. In terms of comparisons against other cards, in Time Spy, so reminiscent of DirectX 12 gaming, we see it's between a Radeon 780M and an R9 290, but still quite shy away from an Overclock 970 or even a 3GB 1060. It is still an older card, but these benchmarks don't mean everything. When we move back to Firestrike, we can see that it is better than older flagships like a GTX 770, but is still lagging behind cards like the 1060, the 290, and the 970, and even a 580, because, well, they are just more modern cards. However, where things actually begin to matter is in the world of Steel Nomad, which is quite reminiscent of those modern games where they are just relentless on VRAM. And because we have 8GB, we see the Quadro M4000, a £30 graphics card, going in and around the performance levels of an R9 Fury or a GTX 1060. In fact, it beats the RX 584GB, the 970, the 750 Ti 8GB, and primarily the reason it's beating all these, other than China's weird 750 Ti, is because it has enough VRAM to deal with the modern world. The thing is though, I can rant and rave and talk about this for hours because I did have a lot of fun doing these BIOS mods and actually dabbling around with overclocking. What you need to know though is, this is a solid card out of the box, but don't leave the free performance available on the table by just applying even a minor overclock to this. You don't have to push it as far as I'm pushing it today, because in reality I'm still limited by running the stock cooler. So we are running things today on a Ryzen 7 3700X system with 32GB of DDR4, ensuring that this graphics card is purely the limit of the system. We aren't running game-ready drivers because, in all honesty, you don't have to, and to be fair, the professional drivers this comes with seem to work well enough, and you get your 3D options and bits and pieces that you might want to mess around with, more on that later. I have also added a little fan pointing at the back of the card. It's not something you have to do, but given the overclock that I decided to run on this model, I thought, you know what, a little bit of extra cooling's not exactly going to go amiss. It did actually help more than I thought it would, but it wasn't preventing any sort of throttling because I'd also turned up the level that this card would throttle at. So with all of this out of the way, is this £30 Nvidia Quadro M4000, just a cheap Quadro card, actually the saviour to modern gaming in the benchmarks? Starting things off, we have the latest release of GTA 5 Enhanced Edition, which defaulted to Ultra settings in 1080p. And with Ultra settings in 1080p, how does it run on a 30 quid Nvidia Quadro? It runs at 56 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 49 FPS, which already out of the box is pretty much close enough to a 60 FPS experience. Honestly, dropping this back to a mixture of high and very high would probably net you a completely solid and silky smooth constant 60 FPS, so if you were looking for a fluent 60 FPS experience, it is something you can get out of the card. But really, if you want to utilise the extra VRAM, turning textures and things up to Ultra is just something you can do for free, and it runs pretty good out of the box. Moving into the world of GTA Online, and unfortunately I forgot to hit record on my capture card, so fortunately I was at least recording the screen, we did return 53 FPS on average, so a minor hit to our average, and slightly worse 1% lows, now down to 44 FPS. Keep in mind you could mitigate this by probably just dropping a few settings, but still both of these results are close enough for 60 FPS that I'd call it good. Not that I want to focus too much on legacy titles, because in these older titles, it's a Maxwell-based card. It is pretty much going to destroy anything DirectX 11 and prior, but GTA 5 Legacy is a great example of it doing this. With Ultra settings in 1080p, so that's all of the normal settings turned right up and a few of the advanced options turned on, we returned 85 FPS, with 1% lows down to 73 FPS. It's also worth noting it's quite difficult to get GTA 5 Legacy to use over 4GB of VRAM, but in these instances, it certainly was, so having 8GB of it on hand that doesn't slow down was rather convenient. Moving into the world of GTA Online Legacy, which as we know is really suffering from utilization, well, lack of it on most cards, and we did see quite the hit to our overall average, now dropping 20 frames per second down to 65 FPS on average, with 1% lows actually being still somewhat okay with around 54 FPS. So GTA Online Legacy is still returning in above 60 FPS experience most of the time, but it's still not going to be as smooth as single player, but still, with 8GB of VRAM it does ensure that this rather lackluster version of the game at this point does still run. Now, one use I can definitely see for a card like this are people wanting to upgrade basic simple systems, say like an Optiplex or something, adding a little 6-pin connector on there, and then running it up into something like Counter-Strike 2, where with competitive settings in 1080p we did return a rather competitive average of 208 FPS on average, with really solid 1% lows down to just 106 FPS, which in CS2 is actually remarkably decent. If you are someone that is interested in the 4x3 resolution of 1280x960, which seems to be very popular these days, our average increased up to 258 FPS, with 1% lows now at 198 FPS. So yeah, it runs pretty good with these settings as well. The only area where I did notice a few problems, shall we say, is all other maps work absolutely fine, but in a competitive scenario in, for example, Cache, which is one of the newer maps out there, we did see our 1% lows suffer more than I thought they would. We still returned 175 FPS on average, but 1% lows were now down to 108 FPS. Now this would get better the longer the match had been going on, so this could be something that goes away with maybe a few updates or bits and pieces, but I would have liked to have seen better 1% lows. Still, it's over 100 FPS, so I can't really argue with it. As we begin to enter the modern world, a good place to start with is Ark Raiders, which is probably one of the best optimized titles running on Unreal Engine 5. And with medium and high settings in 1080p with FSR3 enabled set on balance mode, we returned pretty much a perfect 60 FPS experience. I was sort of expecting this because FSR works remarkably well on Maxwell cards from Nvidia. I know, seems ridiculous, but it does work really well, and given this ran fine on a GTX 970, having that additional VRAM just meant we could push up some of the settings without seeing a dent in the frame rate too much. So we returned 62 FPS on average, 1% lows down to 51 FPS, and I didn't just stop there, because a lot of people are interested in running these types of games with no upscaling at all, and because we've got enough VRAM, and we've got enough power as well, we could do this with no problems. So with the same medium and high settings in 1080p, but this time with no anti-aliasing or upscaling of any sort, we returned 46 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 38. Now really, I think this game does actually benefit from FSR, because we're getting 60 FPS and it's actually quite a nice upscaler going on, but still, if you're not interested in it, you can run the game perfectly fine with still around 40ish frames per second. Now, Oblivion Remastered, I did have to do a little bit of tweaking around to try and get the game running as best as possible, and it was a mixture of low and medium settings with a 30 FPS cap in place in a 900p resolution with no upscaling going on that returned us the best experience. The implementation of FSR in this game is not great, so you're better off running without it where you can. And still, we returned 30 FPS on average with 1% lows down to 24 FPS, and we weren't even using the lowest settings. Now, the reason why this benchmark is important is not because Oblivion Remastered is difficult to run, it's because, well, a lot of cards in this ballpark can't run it. The R9 290 can't run it above 480p, the GTX 970 struggles to run it around 480p, the R9 Fury struggles to run it in 720p. But here you've got a £30 Quadro that has enough headroom that you can run low and medium settings at 30 FPS in a nice 900p resolution. But do you know what game we haven't yet seen playable on any of the graphics cards or systems we've featured on the channel since it came out? Samson. And this is the first graphics card we've got that was able to achieve a 30 FPS experience with the game's default low and medium settings. I did have to have a 30 FPS external cap to try and keep the frame rate smoother, and we were running the TAA or something that it comes on with default, so there was no FSR or anything, it was just the game's built-in native version of making things look smeary. But still, we were able to play the game without the lowest settings at a locked 30 FPS in a 1080p resolution. Would I say it looked good? Not really. Would I say this is impressive given that this was a 30 FPS experience for me when I was playing it on an RTX 3070 laptop? You know what? Yes, I am going to say I'm impressed here, because this is by no means a well-optimized game, but getting a playable 30 FPS experience on a 30 quid Quadro? This is a first for the channel, and I wasn't expecting it today from just a card this cheap. Well, after that barrage of Unreal Engine 5 titles, let's move back to the world of optimization with Cyberpunk 2077, and we ran the game with medium settings and high textures in 1080p with FSR3 set to balance mode. FSR3 is really well implemented in Cyberpunk, so actually looks pretty decent, and it returned us 49 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 41 FPS. Overall, it looked great, it felt pretty smooth, and the one thing I will say here is this was a pretty consistent average across all scenarios. So generally when you were driving, it'd be around the low 40 FPS mark. When not much was going on, it could be between 50 and 60 FPS, and when there was lots of action going on, once again you were back down to the low 40 FPS range. So Cyberpunk 2077 looks great, runs great, as long as you don't mind a bit of upscaling as well. It keeps you above that 30 FPS range at pretty much all times. So Cyberpunk 2077, honestly, I'd have no qualms or problems playing it through on a 30 quid Quadro, because it looked excellent and ran pretty well as well. Fortnite now defaults to DirectX 12 even on these older Nvidia cards, which is an area where they deal with it okay, but they aren't exactly as great at it as they are with DirectX 11. But still, with its default settings of low and medium with DirectX 12 performance mode enabled in 1080p, was this really of any concern when, of course, in a game like this, people are just chasing frame rates. They're not concerned about how the game looks, they just want the highest frame rate possible with a decent bit of view distance on there as well. And what do these settings return? Well, 189 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 156. So honestly, if you were looking for a very smooth and capped experience, just set it to 144 FPS and you're looking at a pretty good time. But Fortnite, if you are looking for a graphics card for it, can you really go wrong with this Quadro? I am just blown away by its performance, because you give it Cyberpunk, it's playable. Then you go to Fortnite and you want it to run high frame rates, does that as well. And it's doing it in 1080p with no problems. Being based on the Maxwell architecture, it does deal with PUBG unreasonably well. With low and medium settings with textures set to high in 1080p while utilising DirectX 11.1, which is listed under the settings as DirectX 11 Enhanced, we returned 87 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 68 FPS, which was a pretty good experience. I can't really argue with it. You cap it at 60 FPS, maybe turn up a few of the other settings if you want it to look better, or turn them down if you're actually playing this competitively, which apparently is something people still do. You're looking at a pretty good time. So PUBG, this is single-handedly beating out most of the equivalent priced AMD cards like the R9 290 and ones like that. I mean, imagine trying to explain this to someone a few years ago when PUBG was big and the idea of running it on a £30 graphics card seemed non-existent. Well, we've now reached the point where even these weird sort of oddball Quadros can run the game fine at well over 60 frames per second, which is definitely more to do with the Maxwell architecture here than it is with the amount of VRAM we've got available, but still, it's a good showing. Next up we have Baldurs Gate 3, which is pretty much only playable on this sort of ballpark of cards if they are Nvidia options. Unfortunately, the Vulkan render options don't work here, which means that DirectX 11 is your only choice. Fortunately, being a Maxwell-based card, especially one that's boosted up with 8GB of VRAM, that really isn't anything but an advantage for a card like this Quadro. It's not exactly the level of performance we got out of a real GTX 970, given that Baldurs Gate 3 isn't particularly heavy on VRAM, but still, architecturally, it does have enough power to be able to brute force its way through the game with high settings, returning an average of 37 FPS and 1% lows down to 31. So this is one of those few instances where you see that it isn't quite a full-fat GTX 970, which was, I'm fairly sure, managing this at ultra settings at a higher frame rate, but then again, it's only those newer titles that we've been testing up to this point that allow it to take advantage of that VRAM and sort of push this card ahead of where you think it'd be. In one of these more optimized titles that isn't stressing out the VRAM, you quickly realize that it's still a powerful card, but in certain instances, it isn't going to be matching a full-fat 970. In recent times, I don't know whether it's been an uptick of popularity, but whenever I don't test Red Dead Redemption 2, people are asking me why am I not testing Red Dead Redemption 2. Fortunately, being an 8GB of VRAM card, it means you can go into the settings menu and actually choose the settings you want to run without the game giving you a VRAM error and telling you you're not allowed to change the settings on your own PC. Thanks Red Dead Redemption 2, but still, that's besides the point. It works fine here because you have plenty of headroom. The game defaulted to medium and high settings with ultra textures, which is where I left things. At least Red Dead Redemption 2 tends to pick pretty good settings, and it was in a full HD 1080p resolution, returning 49 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 43 FPS. I have to say this was markedly better than an actual GTX 970, because the game can actually detect that there's 8GB of VRAM available and choose settings in and around what it wants to use. The VRAM settings in this game are awfully pessimistic, and it doesn't really use as much as it says it's going to, meaning that the actual GTX 970 in this instance is limited to 900p, whereas this Quadro can run the game with these same settings at a similar frame rate in 1080p purely because it has the VRAM to allow the game to do so, at least without going into config files and things like that. So Red Dead 2, no problems on a little Quadro and looked excellent to boot. Given how good value this card is, I did want to chuck in a couple of extra modern titles like S&Box, which we were able to run with medium and high settings in 1080p. The settings didn't really make too much of a difference here because, well, it's S&Box and it still needs a good few optimizations. I mean, we are testing on a 30 quid graphics card, but still, this returned us in and around a 30 FPS experience on the newer version of Construct. 1% lows were likely because of the amount of explosions I was causing, but yes, S&Box will work, but of course, it is going to struggle in certain situations because optimizations are definitely needed in this title. Next up we have the very popular BeamNG, which we ran with high settings in the jungle with traffic enabled, and I'm assuming because of the VRAM available, this wasn't a single bit of a problem for the graphics cards. Genuinely, our average of 40-60 FPS was pretty much perfect, and our 1% lows were only down to 41 FPS. Genuinely, look at the frame times we're getting in this game, and it's kind of one of those reasons why I'm beginning to love the Maxwell architecture, because even when you don't think it should be able to do well, it just does. I mean, having 8 gigs of VRAM, having the overclock, having all these bits and pieces does help, but this is BeamNG. It's just running perfectly fine on what is a £30 graphics card in what is admittedly one of the more intensive scenarios. Now, this is utilising DirectX 11, which I think is being updated soon, but I'd imagine this will also deal with any future rendering updates they bring to the title. So BeamNG, working fine, and if this is one of the more intensive scenarios, then you're pretty much going to be seeing over 60 FPS in any of the simpler ones. Just to get a token Bethesda game in here, we have Fallout 4 Anniversary, which of course does like to take advantage of extra VRAM that may be available on newer cards. That's part of the Anniversary update, and we have seen it become a lot more VRAM intensive. Then again, Maxwell was sort of the architecture of choice if you wanted to play this back in the day, but how is it coping with the Anniversary update? Well, absolutely fine. In fact, it runs smoother now than it did back in the day. Then again, we also do have a card with 8 gigs of VRAM, so that is playing into this slightly. But then again, 57 FPS on average, 1% lows down to 49 FPS. This was during intensive scenarios when you're in built-up areas and also in combat, because when you weren't doing that, the game pretty much ran at a fully locked 60 frames per second. So Fallout 4 Anniversary, not exactly renowned for its optimizations, but it is a little bit better than it used to be, and is running perfectly fine on this £30 Quadro M4000. Now here we have M&B Bannerlord running with high and ultra settings in 1080p, which is how the game defaulted itself to, and this was also with a very high battle size and very high texture streaming budget options. Of course, it can detect it's got 8GB of VRAM, and it is going to utilise them. We ran at an average of 59 FPS, with 1% lows down to 47 FPS, and for some of you keen-eyed viewers, you're probably noticing in the top right that this isn't actually saying it's an M4000, but I will be getting into that into the next section. All you need to know is that was a tweak I made for compatibility, but this card runs fine in this title. That's just something I forgot to change back. Anyway, M&B Bannerlord, it's a perfect experience. What else did we expect? Beautifully optimized title, card with plenty of power, card with plenty of VRAM. It's running in DirectX 11. It's pretty much a perfect storm for ultra settings at 60 FPS on a 30 quid graphics card, so there's no problems from my end on this one. But finally, Can it run Crysis Remastered? Well, I did try and start things off with the high preset in 1080p, but unfortunately this returned us an average of 33 FPS, which sounds great. Unfortunately, 1% lows down to 19 FPS rendered it unplayable. And this was nothing to do with VRAM, this was nothing to do with texture size, there was nothing to do with anything like that. We just don't have enough power to handle some of the effects on high because it does become a lot more intensive. Dropping back most of these settings that weren't texture related down to medium actually netted us about 3 times the increase to our frame rate, with now 88 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 71. So yes, Crysis Remastered works perfectly fine, and with the extra frame buffer you can manage some very high quality textures with no problems whatsoever. Honestly, if you told me at the start of the year I'd come across a £30 graphics card that is easily available that could achieve these types of visuals and these types of frame rates, I said, well, it wouldn't be happening because look at the state of the PC market right now. But honestly, this little Quadro can display visuals like this with no problems. Now, overall performance is genuinely insane value for money. I mean, let's be honest, the RX 580 has somehow become a £70 graphics card in the UK, and the GTX 1060 is following close behind. Meaning that in the old segment they used to dominate, which is this £30 region, there's pretty much nothing but older graphics cards, and then this Quadro. Because the main advantage this card has is the VRAM, because it means that all of those modern titles, Arc Raiders, Oblivion Remastered, and Samson going through Unreal Engine 5, getting progressively harder and less optimized as we go, are still able to achieve 30 FPS at their very worst. Which is admirable for a card this cheap, but it wasn't without its problems. I mean, the only real problem we faced was Arc Raiders, which would throw an incompatible graphics card crash when we launched with just the normal drivers. So the solution to this is to run the same drivers and employ a trick used by a lot of Chinese scam cards, which was to just change what the graphics card is called. And we weren't even doing this through the BIOS. We just went into the drivers and made the PC say that it was running an RTX 4000 or something. And that pretty much got rid of all compatibility problems. Besides that though, this was the one instance where we ran into it, and if you're looking for a fix, it literally is just make sure the PC thinks it's running something more modern. It took me all of 20 seconds to do. Besides this though, everything else I wanted to test ran perfectly. I can't argue with the performance for the money. GTA 5 works fine whether it's the enhanced or the legacy version. Counter-Strike 2 is actually returning a competitive experience. I mean, Cyberpunk is running with even high settings in 1080p, yes, utilizing FSR, but still, it runs perfectly fine. You'd be hard-pressed to find a game that this card can't actually run because it's simply that good for the money. And in newer titles, it beats out 4GB variants of the RX 580, and it beats out 3GB variants of the GTX 1060. And it's going to cost you 30 quid. I cannot stress this enough. Get one before people realise how good they are. Being based on the Maxwell architecture, it is a relatively efficient card, especially with its state out of the box, because if you're just using this out of the box, it will consume at its most 88 watts under full load in a firm-arc stress test. When gaming, it's only hovering around the high 50s as well, which is exceptionally good. With a mild overclock, which is probably how I'd recommend you running this graphics card, it hovers in and around 110 to 121 watts, but with our maximum overclock, which is about as far as you can push this thing on the stock cooler, it will use 150 watts consistently in firm arc, but will hover around 130 watts while gaming, which isn't necessarily bad in terms of power efficiency, but it is a lot for this little stock cooler and little fan to deal with. Because in terms of thermals, once it had been cleaned, it ran around the mid-70s with its stock settings, the mid-80s with its mild overclock, once again how I'd recommend you run this card, but with a maximum overclock, it was hovering in and around the low 90 degrees, which is when I decided to add a fan onto it just to make sure that it didn't get too hot. At the end of the day, it is not a particularly hard card to keep cool. It's not exactly consuming power at an alarming rate. However, it does not exactly have the cooling that is designed for any overclocks further than we pushed it today. If you bolted on a better cooler, then yeah, go wild, push this thing as high as you want, because it is very efficient for the performance it's offering. I mean, it's in and around the actual power consumption levels of an RX 580 undervolted when we're actually overclocking this graphics card, so you can't really knock the efficiency of Maxwell, given that, yeah, I mean, it is running toasty, but you don't have to push it as hard as we're pushing it today. You're only going to lose a couple of frames per second here and there. Finally though, you don't really need to try and force game-ready drivers on here, you don't really need to flash a gaming BIOS. Honestly, Nvidia's professional drivers work fine for gaming. It never used to be like this back in the day, but it turns out in recent times that, yeah, you can just run these Quadro drivers and they are going to pretty much give you fine gaming performance. I couldn't really argue with it. You get plenty of 3D options for older titles, or some newer titles if you're so inclined, and you do also get an Nvidia NVENC encoder. No, it's not going to blow you away, and yes, streaming at lower bit rates probably will suffer compared to modern graphics cards, but still, we're talking about extra features on a graphics card that is in and around the £30 ballpark region. Can you really argue with it when, for how convenient it is with its form factor, you get 4 display ports, you need 1 PCIe lane, you need 1 PCIe 6-pin, and then you're good to go, and you can even stream and record with the card. I opened it up and did a bit of recording utilising Far Cry, the original Far Cry, and there was no compatibility problems with running older titles, which was nice to see. It looks pretty great on the card and ran very, very well, and Nvidia NVENC returned decent results when set to indistinguishable quality. So in terms of extra features, well, it works fine. There's not really any extra tweaking to do beyond the overclocking and BIOS mods because the out-of-the-box drivers work fine for gaming, and I'd imagine they'd also work well for professional stuff if you were so inclined to do it that way. So there we have it, Nvidia's Quadro M4000, and I have been blown away by the performance. I stumbled across this when I was just searching through eBay, and I thought, you know what, I'll have a look at what the specs of that one are, because in reality, the only reason I've been looking at Quadros is I kind of want to get one that's based on a GTX 480, the ones with double the VRAM, and see how good it is, and then I came across this hidden gem. And the prices I've been seeing these go for, I just bought this now. I didn't even go for an auction, I just went on a buy it now, and then picked it up for about 30 quid. And they are going for about this price on AliExpress, eBay, I've seen a few pop up on Marketplace where people are clearing out offices, and what you are getting is a non-cut down GTX 970 with double the VRAM and none of the limitations. None of that 512 megabytes running slower, a full fat 8 gigs of VRAM running at perfect speed, you get the Maxwell architecture, you get decent drivers, you get good power consumption, and yes, you're going to have to tweak around with BIOSes, but it's going to take you all of 15 minutes to do. There's so many guides out there for tuning Maxwell cards that you haven't really got anything to worry about. So if you are looking for a budget graphics card right now, and you're looking for something that does tick all the boxes that a 1060 or an RX 580 used to before prices on them shot up, this is the graphics card to get. And it's very rare that I come around to something so definitively, but it works great. Even if you don't want to BIOS mod it, name another £30 graphics card that is this convenient and still getting up-to-date drivers that will play GTA 5 out of the box at a locked 60 FPS with ultra settings. And that's with no tweaking at all. It's only if you want to start pushing it, you have to. Anyway, I hope you've all enjoyed this video. For me, personally, the M4000 is the card to get right now, midway through 2026. So I hope that those of you that have found this helpful have managed to get one, and I hope you enjoy your card. So thank you all very much for watching, I hope you've enjoyed the video, and good night.